Welcome to the third lecture of Perspectives. We have Aanchal Malhotra with us today. She is a writer and an oral historian from New Delhi. She is the co-founder of the Museum of Material Memory and the author of two critically acclaimed books, Remembrance of a Separation and In the Language of Remembering, that explore the human history and generational impact of 1947 partition. Her recently published novel, Everlasting Things, is her debut novel. Can we please have Aanchal on the stage? Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Shall I wait a minute so that people can get seated? No response. That's okay. Okay. Shall I wait or start? Okay. So, in the northern Indian city of Jammu, a man offers me a scrapbook he's kept about Mirpur, the city he was born in, now across the border in Pakistan. There are photographs and newspaper clippings collected over the years, memories from his childhood that he's written down. He was 12 years old at the time of partition, and with clarity, he recalls how he escaped almost getting his ear shot off. His father and two of his uncles had been hacked to death in front of him. His mother and grandmother had been taken to a refugee camp, leaving only him and his sister. Later during that trip, I also interviewed his sister. Hand in hand, the siblings had walked for 3 days from Mirpur to Jhangar in India, wearing the same clothes, neither eating nor drinking anything along the way. And as he walked, he remembered the names of every single family member he had lost that day. When I met him, he asked me, "Tell me who I can blame for what happened." And he acknowledged that if Hindus and Sikhs had been massacred in what became Pakistan, then so had Muslims in what remained India. At the end of our conversation, he said that despite everything he had witnessed, he actually wished to return to where he had come from, if not in life, then in death. "I have written it in my will." He said this to me as he held this notebook. "I have written it in my will. I want my ashes to be submerged in the Chenab River in Akhnur, from where they will flow westward into Pakistan, back to Mirpur, across this border, to the place where I was born." Even 76 years later, partition remains a survival, a loss, a history, a memory, a burden, a war, a wound, all at once. This is its tragedy and its legacy. My name is Aanchal Malhotra. I am an oral historian and a writer, and for the past 10 years, I have been trying to record and write the human history of partition. Technically, this is what partition looks like. You all must have seen maps like this. Yes? Simple, like head nod. Yeah, okay. The withdrawal of the British Empire in India in August 1947 led to the drawing of what is known as the Radcliffe Line between now independent nations of India and Pakistan. It forced Hindus and Sikhs to move eastward to India, and Muslims to move westward to Pakistan. Pakistan was further bifurcated in 1971 when Bangladesh came into being. This is what we learn when we learn about partition in school. We learn about maps, we learn about statistics. But when we think of partition, when we think even of the word, these are the images that come to mind. These horrific snapshots of communal violence. I'm sure everyone has seen this image before, multiple times. Trains packed with people in a manner that one would find difficult to breathe in, or caravans of refugees walking from one country to another, or the state that they found themselves in once they came to the refugee camps, or photographs of the camp themselves. This is a pretty important photograph, actually. All of these photographs were taken by the American photographer Margaret Bourke-White for Life magazine. This particular image is taken in the Purana Killa refugee camp. If anyone has gone to Delhi and they've gone to Old Fort, has anyone been there? Well, you're not going to see anything that looks like this because there is no remain of this camp, but this was the camp that housed some of the largest numbers of refugees during partition, Muslim refugees that were migrating to Pakistan. Margaret Bourke-White took these images that depict, in the moment of partitioning and independence, the depth and sheer trauma of what people went through. These are the kinds of images that are synonymous with partition. We do not really think of the story that I began my presentation with, a story of returning, if not in life, then in death, of the complicated nature of remembering and forgetting. We don't think that it's possible to have survived unthinkable violence, been expelled from your homeland, set up a new home against all odds in a new land, learn a new language, a new skill to find work, be bitter and angry, and yet somewhere in your heart, continue to long for the land you left behind. We don't think of these very complex contradictions. No, it's far more common to remember partition through the dichotomy of us versus them, Indian versus Pakistani, Muslim versus non-Muslim, good versus bad. But as I learnt, it's not so easy. If you grow up in India and learn about partition in school, as I did and I suspect most of you did, you will receive, for the most part, a statistical education. And I mention this, I use the school analogy because this is really where we first learn about historical events. We learn a statistical history of partition, 14 million people displaced, 1 million killed. But I don't know what 14 million people looks like. I've never seen so many people. I don't even know what 1 million people looks like. So that's just a number for me. It is only recently that any form of oral history or testimony is included in these school curriculums that offers a sense of nuance. But by reducing people to these 14 million people displaced and 1 million killed, by reducing them to numbers and statistics, we erase the stories that they carry with them, their unique fears and dreams, their challenges and accomplishments. We dilute and diminish them to the same experience. And as a result, the politics of partitioning actually overshadows their individuality. Now, the question I get asked most often is, why did you begin thinking and writing about partition? What got you interested? You're so young. And when I began 10 years ago, I was even younger, so I got asked this question a lot. Why is someone so young writing about something so old and something so sad? How do you know anything about the past? And the answer is these four people. My grandparents, they came from as far as Dera Ismail Khan in the northwest frontier province to Mandi Bahauddin and Lahore in West Punjab. They traveled 2 days and 2 nights by train and boat sometimes and made Delhi their home in 1947. But growing up, I was never told any stories about what they had witnessed or even about how their lives changed because of partition. And like many others, they chose to practice silence. Partition is perhaps a very unique subject where when you get asked a question, as a young person, when you ask your grandparent or your parent about partition, you will always get asked a question back. So you may say, well, how old were you in 1947? Did you witness this partition? How did it happen? And they may say, well, why do you want to know? What will it change? This is what happened with my grandparents. They would always want to know why I wanted to know. And at the beginning, I guess you don't really know how to ask these questions either. You fumble over the correct terminology. Like for me, could I say the word refugee? It had been so many decades. Can I speak about the violence that I've seen in films? Was their journey like that? Was it like Gadar? And when these questions are met with more questions, or perhaps when they are met with silence, you start to feel like an intruder. You start to feel like your questions are invasive, like you don't belong in that conversation. And later you realize that the reason for this silence could, of course, be that they don't want to talk about that part of the past, or they don't have the vocabulary to talk about that past. What are the words to speak about loss, to speak about homelessness? How do you tell someone, I fled from my home, I had nothing, I lived in a camp, I lost my family? What is the vocabulary of partition? Sometimes it is not always verbal. This is my grandmother, and she's in the middle holding the child. This is my grandmother and her family at the Kingsway refugee camp in Delhi. It is one of the few photos I have of the camp, and actually the photo is not even as big as my palm. It's a very small photo. My grandmother stayed in this camp for nearly 10 years after partition. You can see the barracks at the back. You can see that they are smiling. One of the things I always ask her is, why are you smiling? Why are you laughing? And she said there could be one or two reasons. One is someone was taking our picture, and that was not very common in those days. And the second thing is that we were all together. So despite the tragedy of partition, despite living in a camp, and the camp is actually exactly what you'd imagine a camp to be. It was tent after tent after tent. There were barracks like in the back for ration, kitchens, public latrines. She said we were together. It's also where my grandparents met and got married. It's also where my grandmother's sister met her husband and got married. So the camp extends to larger places than just tragedy. Now, of course, knowing what happened in the past changes everything, because somewhere along the story of your ancestors begins your story. I was 23 years old, still in a master's program, when I first asked about partition, seriously asked about partition. And it was because I was introduced to the objects that my family had carried across the border with me. These are the objects. You can see how varied they are, because each brings with them a story, a reason why they were carried across the border, a reason why they made the journey. Perhaps they were valuable enough to be sold, as in the case of jewelry. Perhaps they were just mundane things that you needed in a kitchen, like this plate or this ghada. Or they were weapons to save yourself, should you need to. Because asking directly felt too invasive, I turned to these objects. My path to the undivided land belonged in belongings. See, you are all going to be practitioners one day. You are all some form of creators, artists. You work with your hands, you touch things, you understand the tactile nature of material. And so you will understand that objects are very powerful catalysts to record periods of time, but also that by themselves they cannot speak. An object is just an object. It is just metal, it is just paper, it is just gold, silver, it doesn't matter. It requires the infusion of memory and story, of history and historical context to bring it to life. Because each crack, each engraved initial, each small tear in a shawl or the loose binding of a book, it tells a story. And as I was working with these objects, I felt quite devoted to them, to tell the story of partition through them, considering them equal protagonists to the people. So here I was with objects and people. I started with my family and then branched out to others, and the questions I would ask really took people by surprise. It wasn't, oh, did you live through partition? Tell me about it. No, because I had seen in my family that that practice felt quite invasive. I took another route. Why did you carry this thing? What did it mean to you then? Where was it kept in your house? Was it precious? Was it mundane? What does it mean to you now? Do you still use it? Do you wish that you had carried something different? Who told you to bring this thing? Oh, your family. What were they like? What was your mother like? What language did she speak? Were your parents educated? Did they read the paper? Did they listen to the radio? Is that where they heard about partition? How old were you at the time? Do you remember it? Where did you hide this object when you carried it across? One of the things I learned very quickly from talking to people was that partition did not just happen in the year 1947, in the month of August, or on the dates 14th and 15th. It was a drawn-out process, starting far earlier, and as many would argue, has still not normalized. It exists psychologically, emotionally, and of course geographically and physically in the land. So I began asking people about their objects. There I was, 10 years ago, asking about things, going into people's cupboards, following them down hallways, trying to understand the notion of belonging to a place through the belongings that remained of that place. I traveled to India, speaking across India, speaking to people who had migrated from Pakistan and those who had chosen to remain in India as minorities. I traveled to Pakistan to speak to those who had migrated there, as well as minorities that chose to remain there. And I also want to say that migration at Partition wasn't just Hindu or Sikh or Muslim as we largely understand. There were Christians and Jews and Parsis and Anglo-Indians and Buddhists and many others who were also displaced. Not to mention the repercussions of this partition on the British. And so through the objects, people eventually spoke about themselves. They unburdened, they talked of violence, of course, but they also talked about homeland and family and friendship and love, like the story I began with. They talked about things like that. They were often saying these things for the first time, holding on to these objects, touching them, transported back to that time when that object may have been used in their house in childhood. And it was through these conversations that I learned how to be an active listener. Now, I don't think I was much older than all of you are. And I think one of the things that we take so much for granted is our ears. We hear things, but we don't actually listen to things. As young people, when someone is speaking, we are already thinking of what we may say to them. But I will give you this advice, and take it if you want or not. Learn to listen to people, because you will learn a lot about themselves and yourself in that process. So I learned that there were so many more ways to tell a life story. To be a keen observer, to watch as people moved, as they laughed, as they cried, when they switched languages. Why did they switch languages? It's the story of the past in the language of the past. When my grandfather speaks to my grandmother, he speaks in Punjabi. When he speaks to me, he speaks in English. Is the language of the present English? These are the questions I started asking. I thought about when they refrained, when they gave in to my questions, and when remembrance became too much. I want to go through some of these objects just to show you how material culture can reclaim forgotten, hidden, unspoken histories. Histories, as I mentioned, that may not yet have vocabularies. So what kind of objects did people carry? They obviously carried ordinary utensils. This is a hammam dasta that made its way from Karachi to Bombay on ship. They carried religious items. They were they're so small, these idols. They were kind of folded in one's chunni because she was afraid that someone at the border would steal them from her. They carried bigger religious items. This is quite a large Guru Granth Sahib that is still read every day. It came from Rawalpindi. They carried textiles. This is from Multan. It's called a loi. And this is the really beautiful thing about oral narratives, that one story always leads to another. So when this woman was telling me about how this loi was carried from Multan to India, she sang a song that they used to sing. And she was sort of transformed into this younger version of herself that had been given this loi as a child. Another really old textile, this is fulkari, which is famous in Punjab. It's over 100 years old, and it's very, very, very warm. It also came from Rawalpindi, and it was raining a lot in August in 1947 during the days of partition. It was incessant rain, so it was humid and hot and sticky. And the lady who carried this, her grandmother, fulkari is very heavy, it's very warm, it's made with khadi and silk threads. So you wear it in the winter, it's very warm. In this August heat with rain and sweat, because she didn't want to leave this fulkari behind, she wore it over her clothes. As many people did, they wore their possessions and came to India or went to Pakistan. Does anyone know what this is? Does anyone want to garner a guess? No, never mind. Yes. that's a good guess. Close enough, but no, I guess it could be used for that. It's called a khasdan. Everyone knows what a pandan is, where you have little ingredients for your pan. Well, after you make your pan, you put it in this little cloche-like thing for a special guest, khas mehman. And you place it and you put the cover over and you say, ye aapke liye, and then they take the pan and they say adab and they eat the pan, and it's like a nice little ritual. But these were objects of cultural significance that were really prevalent in parts of UP, more traditional parts of Punjab, and this woman's family chose to carry this with her to Multan from Punjab in India. More obvious choices, jewelry was a very popular thing that people carried because they could sell it. These are a few lucky pieces that didn't get sold. And you can tell, you see the imperfections, look at the ring, look at how it's made. This kind of work is not done anymore, and I doubt any jeweler will even touch it today. Photographs. If you were lucky enough to have family photographs, many people carried them. I remember this incident where my nani's sister was telling us about how they escaped from Lahore and went to Shimla and then came to Delhi, and her daughter very naively asked, I've never seen any baby photos of you. You know, do you have any? What did you look like as a child? And my nani's sister said, the oldest photo I have is from when I was 10, when I came to India, because their house burned down in Lahore and there was almost no documentation of a life before that left anymore. It was quite sad to be a part of that conversation. People carried documents. This is a British Indian passport. Has anyone seen this before? Okay, because Indians were citizens of the empire, pre-partition, they had British Indian passports if they had passports. After partition, there was something called an India-Pakistan passport as well that would allow refugees whose families had been divided because of partition to go back and forth, and also for specifically Sikh pilgrims whose shrines and gurdwaras remained in Pakistan for easy access and travel. After the 71 war and creation of Bangladesh, there was also something called an India-Bangladesh passport, which is a blue booklet, light blue booklet. People carried educational certificates, they carried IDs, they carried certificates from their work because they thought they would get similar jobs or education on the other side. And for the most part, they did. It would prove that you were a graduate, it would prove that you had a metric certificate, things like that. Now, these are the most heartbreaking kinds of objects when people carry locks and keys. For many people that migrated during partition, there was a certain amount of disbelief that partition would be permanent. They just couldn't understand how the land that they had lived in for most of their life was suddenly not theirs. And they thought that once the riots died down, they would return. So they locked their houses, they brought their keys, and they almost never went back. There is a story I remember from the author Gurjar Andaz, who told me that his grandmother came to India from Pakistan with a guchha of 51 keys. She locked everything. She locked the cupboard. She locked the drawer in the cupboard. She locked the cupboards in the kitchen. She locked the kitchen. She locked the window. She locked the main door. She locked everything. And what is more, she employed a local woman to clean the house before they came back, as if they were going on vacation or something. Now think about it, if the house is locked 51 times, how does the woman get in? But that's just a practical question. But she came to India with this bunch of 51 keys of a house she would never return to, and he remembers seeing it as a child. And it's such a heartbreaking symbol of a loss of home. I want to tell a story about this woman. And this is really how families across the border sometimes share stories in very unique ways. Now, I went to Lahore to do my research, and I met this lady. She's lovely, isn't she? She looks so graceful. Her name is Sitara Fiaz Ali, and she is the daughter of the first Muslim Vice Chancellor of Punjab University, Mia Afzal Hussain, who was a big advocate for women's education and the arts. Those were the two things that he greatly advocated for. Now, this is her father, distinguished looking gentleman. Stara Fiaz Ali speaks to me about these utensils that she carried from Gurgaon, which is very close to Delhi, all the way to Miawali in Pakistan. But she really actually doesn't want to talk about these things. She just kind of mentions them. I have these objects, they belong to my mother-in-law. I received them when I got married, I carried them to Pakistan. What she really wants to talk about is a house. She wants to talk about a house in Dalhousie that her father built over a period of, say, 20 years, because it's very hard to build in the hills. And she missed that house. And that house was called Kehkishan, which in Urdu means galaxy. Now, I don't make much of this house because I'm there in Lahore, I'm looking at these two objects, I write about these objects, and then I just ask her, well, who lives in this house now in Dalhousie? And she says, two Sikh brothers live there. That's all I know. Now, as you know, I'm a writer. So I write a book about these objects. I mention that two Sikh brothers live in this house. It's one line in the book, really. It's not a big mention. Book comes out. About a month later, a man finds me. And he says, I'm one of the brothers who lives in the house. And he's really worked up, he's really agitated. How is his house in a book? How do I know this other kind of story? So he invites me to meet him and his brother. There they are, lovely gentlemen, with my book at the Gymkhana in Delhi. And I meet them and I hear their story. I hear the story of how they made it across from a place called Kallar Saidan near the Rawalpindi area to India, and how they came to live in this house. This is the two brothers. They're so lovely, sweet little photograph. This is the house. The black and white photo is what Mrs. Ali showed me in Lahore. It's what she had from her childhood. The colored photo is when one of her family friends visited Dalhousie. They took a photograph, and that's how she knew that the house was still standing and who lived in it. Now, because I am, I guess, me, and I need to know everything about this house that I didn't pay enough attention to before, I invite myself to the house. And it was really a conversation, like I was speaking to the brothers, and I was like, "To main kal aa jaun fir?" And they were like, "Why not?" So here is the house, here is Kehkishan, and I can't explain to you what it feels like to not believe something stands, and then you stand in front of it and there it is, and it's exactly how it was described to you. It's exactly the same. So I stay for a week in this house and I try to find out the history of the family that lives there, and ultimately I want to know as much as I can about this house. And I find this is the living room. Afzal Hussain was obsessed with astronomy, the thing with stars. And so Sitara Fiaz Ali, her sister's name is Surya. The house is called Kehkishan, which means galaxy. These stars are the ceiling. Every ceiling was made like this. You are all architects, take notes. The Sikh family kept his nameplate. I don't know why people keep the things of others except for the memory, or maybe somewhere in the future someone will come and say, this belonged to my father. Can I see it? Can I touch it? Does it still speak to me? So they kept it. And I was really moved by that, of course, but it wasn't enough for me. I went to the municipal office. Because these are British-era buildings, the British were very particular about records. They love to keep records of everything. And so I ask the peon there, I'm looking for the buildings of Mia Afzal Hussain, and he says to me, "Aapko nahi milengi, madam." And I say, "Well, I'll help you find them." And he opens the door to this room, which is like half the size of the stage, and it's filled with file after file after file, dust, oh my God, so much dust. Aapko nahi milengi. And I'm there opening file after file until I find file number 123, Buildings of Mia Afzal Hussain, and I swear I feel like I could cry. So I open it and I start taking photos of everything, because what else are we going to do? I have to send Mrs. Ali something. She said to me over the phone when I told her I'd found her house, she said, oh, I hope that they send, these Sikh brothers, I hope they send me a photograph of the house. And I said, we're going to do more than that. I start WhatsApping her photos, and the PN is like, you can't take any photos of this. And I said, well, too bad. I'm going to take photos of this. So I did. And it is so detailed. He writes letter after letter, and this is how you know how hard it is to build in the mountains, because he says, I would like to build a kitchen, and I would like to take out these 2 trees, and I would like permission, and it goes on and on and on. There are floor plans, and of course drainage systems, and all kinds of very complicated maps. And then I find something really weird. This is the name of the architect. This architect built my grandfather's home in Delhi in the 50s. It really, really, it's like worlds colliding. So on the right is the last letter that Afzal Hussain wrote, and it is just months before partition. He does not have any intention of leaving India, and partition forces his entire family out of the country. Dalhousie, which was a part of Gurdaspur district, was over 51% Muslim, and so Muslims thought, and in fact many people thought, that it would be part of Pakistan. But it is also one of the rare examples, along with, say, Malda and maybe a few other areas, where a Pakistani flag went up on August 14, and when the partition line was actually announced on August 17, that flag was replaced by an Indian one, because it fell in India. And so the Muslims that lived in Dalhousie left in caravans. They took whatever they could. They fled violence. And Afzal Hussain and Sitara Fyaz Ali were those people. Now, because I am in Dalhousie, my intention really is to get the families to speak to each other. And so Dalhousie has very patchy network. You're in the mountains, network is patchy. At the time, Geo wasn't available. So they're talking to each other through Skype, and I don't know what this is, whatever. And what are they really talking about? The Indian family and a Pakistani family are talking about a house they share, the history of the house that they share. Multiple generations of these families are present, and they're saying, Sitara Fyaz Ali is saying, did you see on the dining table this scratch? I was this years old when I made that scratch. And the Indian, the Sikh family is saying, there's a little hidden compartment in the dresser. What's that for? And they're talking not as Hindu or Muslim or Sikh or Indian, as Pakistani. They're talking as two families that share the history of a house, one that was forced to leave it and one that got it as a claim for what had been left behind on the other side. And it really got me thinking about the personal and generational legacy of partition, how it impacts so many people's lives, people that weren't even involved at that moment of partitioning. So I wrote a book about these objects, and as I was writing it, I was just thinking about how memory does not end with the generation that lived it, with those who lived through partition. It's passed down, often in silence. There is a relationship between a generation that has lived through a historical trauma and a generation that has inherited that trauma. And while we have started to assert importance to eyewitness accounts, to oral testimony, we may not necessarily attribute the same seriousness to descendant testimony because of the distance they have from the event. What can be felt second-handedly? Can I feel the same pain as my grandmother who is here? Can I feel the same loss? Probably not. But I feel a shade of it. I feel something with distance. So it is important for this kind of descendant archive to grow as well, to see the ways in which the consequences of partition are disseminated and manifested. So I start thinking on another tangent. More often than not, the initial discovery of a family history of partition leads to more questions. There is curiosity and confusion among subsequent generations. How did it happen? What happened? The shock of the scale and depth of violence and migration. Sometimes the more we ask, the more we are told. Sometimes the more we ask, the more questions we are asked back. And when there is no one left to recall the days, we dive into written records, we dive into recorded material, we begin kind of like a patchwork of research with scraps of information like the names of cities and villages that may as well have been changed now. We want to make sense of what happened to our ancestors, but we realize that it's actually very difficult to make sense of something so belatedly, particularly when the event itself seems devoid of all sense. So, how are stories of trauma transmitted and received? Are they offered with intention? Do they need to be exhumed? All of these people in these photographs are people that I've interviewed that have shared stories of partition with each other, but do they cause pain in the retelling, both to the ancestor and to the descendant? And is there any point in talking about partition at all? Do we need to really talk about it 75, 76 years later? These were the questions I was asking myself, and then later I was asking these descendants. And this project was very different than the one with survivors. Survivors had objects, they had items, they had catalysts to urge their memory to resurface. What did descendants carry? What do we have? We have an inheritance that is intangible and invisible. We have emotion. That's all we have. That's all we share with our ancestor. We have anger, bitterness, silence, loss, identity, memory, regret, love, hope, separation, reunion. We have families that have been divided. We have questions, so many questions about the borderland, about no man's land. How did it happen? Did you walk? Did you take a bus? Did you take a train? Did you take a bullock cart? The specificities of your migration, the thing I kept asking my grandmother again and again. What was your first night like at the camp? What did you eat? What were your hair like? What clothes were you wearing? I asked her to return to the camp again and again and again. I had so many questions. I had questions about how the air can be divided in an undivided land, about how water, music, sunshine, rain, all these things, how can you divide them? These are such abstract questions. But I began asking these questions and interviewing people who had inherited stories. Sometimes they were too young at the time of partition to actually remember what had happened, so they had also inherited stories. Other times these interviewees were just teenagers, so decades removed from the tragedy. And I found that the resulting interviews were serious mediations on family history and migration. I have included some of them here. Do you think memory is strong enough to create a landscape of the past? I'm asking this question. Strong enough that you can return to the past through those memories? Isn't that exactly what memory is? To facilitate the imagination of a place, a time, a home. Now, this is a very serious mediation from a very young person. I found they were second generation, third generation, sometimes fourth generation. I found that the geography of these conversations extended across regions and religions, seasons and time zones, personal and political, and weaving them into a coherent form, for me, a book, was a very emotionally demanding process, but together they seem to hold the shape of a once partitioned land. This is a researcher from Pakistan who writes about Lucknow. And she says one of the most important questions and one of the most common questions people ask me is, why haven't you been to Lucknow yet? Her family was from Lucknow, grandparents, great-grandparents. And she says it's not really that important for me to go to Lucknow. The physical space is somehow less significant than the imagined one, the one in people's minds, the ones they carried, the ones they've nurtured. They return to it in their memories, and I return with them through second-hand memory. This is what I do in a lot of my work. I return with people, and anyone who works with imagined landscapes does the same thing. I know it's a long text, but you don't have to read it. I'll explain you the gist of it. This is an interview with a young Sikh artist who grew up in Canada, and he says, I never really understood. His ancestors are from Kashmir. They settled in Baramulla after partition. And we've been talking about this for a long time until we come to this part of the conversation. And it's very rare for my interviewees to ask me questions, though I always encourage it. But I think sometimes people feel really awkward that they're not really sure of the interviewee-interviewer process, so they don't really ask. So he asked me, don't you feel sad when you think of partition? And no one really ever asked me that, so I'm really taken aback. And I say, yes, I feel sad, but that word, it's not heavy enough. That word feels like helium almost. It's light, it dissipates. I feel something heavier, something more weighted, and I even write, like, I laugh, but I want to cry, because every day thinking about partition, every day writing about partition, holding on to other people's sadness. And then he tells me, after partition, when my paternal grandfather was dividing time between Srinagar and Jammu, he heard news of a distant cousin who had been abducted during the violence. She now lived in Pakistan and had a family there, but she would come across the border and wait to see if anyone appeared on the other side. And the Jammu and Sialkot border at the time, it would have been shortly after partition, it was not a fortified border as it is today. So they would stand on either side of the border and wave. And they were families separated by a border, a line, and a road. That's it, there's just a road. There are conversations you have with people across the border sometimes where you almost forget that they're in a whole other country. I have a friend, Farhan, and he's also a historian. He writes about the remaining Hindu and Sikh architecture in Lahore, which was a largely syncretic city. Sometimes when we speak as friends, I forget that he's in Lahore and I'm in Delhi, because when it rains in Delhi, it rains in Lahore. When there is smog in Delhi, there is smog in Lahore. I forget that I celebrate Independence Day one day after him. Sometimes when I'm speaking, I genuinely forget that we are in different countries, but of course the politics of partition does not allow us to permanently forget that. This is very interesting. This was an interview with two siblings, and the girl said to me that I think I was 5 years old when I heard the word partition, and I remember asking, how do you remember? And she said that they were raised in London, and so she said, I was told I was born in exile. To be born in exile. Of course, people with divided families, they carry the brunt of this separation really every day, whether it is a marriage or a death or a birth of a child or any form of celebration or sadness. They cannot share it because of the shackles of the border. And so people celebrate Independence Day across India and Pakistan, but in our family we lament it because it comes with too much pain. So in these conversations with people, because they are so young and they were so removed from partition, often no one had really asked them how they felt, and so many of them were quite surprised as to how much they had to say about it, because they had not really seriously considered the second-handed nature of memory. And I will end here because I've spoken for far too long already, but I will end with this. I've written 2 books about partition, should you wish to read them. And of course, I will answer any questions you may have. Oh, sorry. Here. No questions? Yeah. Do you want this? Yeah? Okay. Okay.
I want to know, when you talk with these people
Yeah.
who has gone through this,
Yeah.
are you awkward about that or like nervous? Like what would their reaction be when you will
naturally, because I'm human. And you're asking someone basically the saddest part of their life. You're asking them to offer it to you. So you have to ask with certainty and sincerity, because you have to be prepared for what you may receive. And it's not always like I ask and they tell. No. Because sometimes, specifically with survivors, older people, sometimes even if they know that you're coming to their house to talk to them about this, they won't feel like talking, or they won't feel well, or we will be mid-conversation and then they'll say, okay, Abbas, or would you rather we not talk about this? I don't want to remember. So these are things that you have to kind of get used to. That's like being in the field. It's normal. But you're of course nervous because you're excavating someone's history. It is deeply meaningful. And it is meaningful because it will outlive them and it will outlive you, right? So it's a very important, intimate interaction. Yeah. Yeah, sure. There are some here. Okay, yeah. I can hear you if you just say it. Thank you. Yeah,
Investigation, so to say. So,
it's a great
how
word, investigation. Yeah.
how did you proceed to find these people, these individuals who had these experiences? How did you stumble upon them? Yeah.
There was no stumbling. I mean, it's always organic, isn't it? Like, because I come from a partition impacted family, my first points were, of course, my family. And then I would say, do you know someone else? Can I speak to someone else? And mind you, when I started the project, I was only looking for objects, which severely narrows down your search. So when I would, say, go to a family friend's house, and I would say, okay, do you know someone else who may have carried something? And they would tell me, and they would tell me, and it became like a web. But there were also very unconventional means that I took. I told everyone in my family, if you meet anyone old, ask them. So my aunt would go for a walk, evening walk, and whenever she saw someone old, she would say, did you come from across the border? Did you carry something with you? It was harder in Pakistan because I didn't know anybody at all, and so I applied to be a short-term researcher at an organization that does archiving work with elderly folk, and they put me in touch specifically with people who had migrated from India. But it's organic. Like I wish there was a list. I wish the process was more streamlined, but it was kind of chaotic, and it really was an investigation because up on my wall was like photos of people, and it looked like one of those detective, yeah, right, yeah.
Hi. First of all, your story was really touching. Like you just narrated it and it was really touching. And so I have a question that how did it emotionally affect you while you were interviewing those people? Like it must have had an impact.
I think it changes you significantly as a person because, I mean, you're 23, what do you know about anything to do with life, let alone a partition? Yeah, I think I must have conducted hundreds and hundreds of interviews, but I don't actually know what it feels like to be in a situation like that. So it significantly changes you as a person, but it also forces you to mature quite quickly, more than you ordinarily would have had. So, little things like you're, I'm standing up here giving a lecture, recounting hundreds of stories just like this, because I've lived them and they mean something to me and they have been embedded in me, and it is obviously an emotional recounting. But I guess you feel the responsibility of that history, I feel it. It's changed me. It's completely changed me.
Hello, ma'am.
Hi.
So, ma'am, my question is that what really inspired you to dive deep into the entire partition history, And my other question was like, when you when you went to Pakistan, did you face any racism?
But they're the same race as us.
no, like in the sense, after the division, Pakistan and Indians, like,
अच्छा, आप Indian हो, okay.
like that.
Okay. Answering your first question, I started working on it because I didn't know anything about partition. And I felt quite embarrassed that somehow I had lived 23 years of my life without knowing where I came from. And it's only going to get worse. Like, if I didn't know anything, then, I mean, I don't have children, but my nieces and nephews, they may not know anything. And this is how history gets diluted and then erased. If we don't have the oral testimony of people who lived through magnanimous moments. So that's the first thing, to just know more about where I come from. Second question about Pakistan. They're the same as us, by the way, yeah? Same. Seriously. So did I feel interesting? Because I felt like I was the other there. I remember I was in an interview where this couple who had both come from UP and gone to Lahore, different parts, Lahore and Karachi, different parts of their life, they said, पार्टीशन के दौरान हमारी फैमिली के साथ ये हुआ वो हुआ, बड़े इंटॉलरेंट थे हिंदूज़, ये ट्रेन जला दी, ये कर दिया वो कर दिया, हिंदू हिंदू हिंदू. I'm sitting there, I'm wondering, do they know that I'm Hindu? Should I say something? So I said, क्या आप जानते हैं कि मैं हिंदू हूँ? You know I'm Hindu? And they said, नहीं तुम तो बेटी हो. No, this is common. This is common. It is easy to speak of a community as the other. It's much harder to do it as an individual. Right? Think about it in your own life. When you meet somebody who is the other, and the other can be anything to somebody, anyone that we don't know enough about or who we fear, it is easy to label a community. But the minute someone from that community becomes your friend or comes to your house, you're like, okay, this is not what I thought. So I was in Lahore, I was getting my nails done in the Gymkhana Club, and I'm sitting in the seat, and this woman is filing my nails. And you know, this is really the joy of fieldwork, because you get these formal interviews and you just get these very random interactions that add to your understanding. And she says, Bibi, tusi kahan se ho? Where are you from? Are you from tusi Karachi se ho? Tusi Islamabad se ho? I said, Delhi se hu. And I was like, okay, now I've said it, now she's going to say something. So she said, drops my hand, looks, voice is really low. Aap Bharat se ho? This is not the funny bit. I'll get to that. I'm like, great, now she's going to ask me, Kashmir ke mudde pe aap mujhe kuch bataएं. Like, this is just going to be this kind of conversation, right? Because I don't know what to expect. And she says, प्याज का दाम क्या है वैसे भारत में? यहाँ तो इतना महंगा. प्याज का दाम क्या है भारत में? अच्छा, आप अपने गोश्त में आलू डालते हैं? They watch Star Plus there. They watch all these सास बहू serials. आपके गहने कहाँ पे हैं? आपने साड़ी क्यों नहीं पहनी? आप हिंदी में क्यों नहीं बात कर रहे? I'm like, मैं हिंदी में बात कर रही हूँ. तो उर्दू की तरह क्यों है? अच्छा, सिंदूर कौन पहन सकता है? बिंदी कहाँ है आपकी? बिंदी क्या होती है? These are the questions this young woman, who is not much older than me, is asking me, because she actually doesn't know what an Indian looks like. Right? They are the same. They are the same. If you go with openness, they will receive you with openness. हम लाहौर में पुराने शहर में गए, कहाँ से हैं आप? दिल्ली से हैं, आप तो फ्री में ले जाएंगे. मेहमान हैं आप हमारे, बड़ी मेहमान नवाजी होती है वहाँ पे. They are very, very hospitable. People-to-people relationship with Indians and Pakistanis is beautiful. If you go to America, you hear someone speaking your language, you hear someone speaking Hindi, immediately you're like, कहाँ से है भाई? अच्छा अच्छा लाहौर, oh मैं दिल्ली से हूँ. And then you start talking. Why are we such good friends when we are away from our territories? It bears mentioning. You must think about this. Why are we so territorial when we are in our territories? This is the tragedy of partition. There's an interview in one of my books where a Sindhi woman, Sindhi who came and stayed in Gujarat, then after she says, I went to America in the 60s and 70s, and I met a Pakistani man. We became friends, and he said that मेरी दादी ने मुझे कहा था कि किसी गोरी औरत को मत ले आना, क्योंकि तू कह नहीं पाएगा कि तू मेरा जिगर का टुकड़ा है. How will I say to her, you are a piece of my liver? Only someone of my own can understand that. And they are laughing. An Indian Pakistani is laughing over Jigar Ka Tukda because they understand each other. They can see each other's names in this foreign land, but they are the other to everybody. They are something to each other. Right? So the relationships between people, they are very meaningful. And I guess what work like this does, or other writers who work on any form of oral narrative, they try to blur the border a little bit so you can see that. Right? Sorry, I went on and on.
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
ma'am.
Yeah, hi.
Hi. So you have interviewed a lot of people for this. So are there any stories or any part of their stories that you leave out for your book, or they're so special that you feel like maybe I should just gatekeep this part of the story? And
On the
or
contrary.
are there any interviewees who say that maybe don't put this portion of
Plenty of times. Plenty of times. The interview is a very collaborative process, and I'm very transparent about that. I'm interviewing you. You have a right to see what goes in a book, in a piece, in an essay, in a video, whatever I do. So when I interview someone, I transcribe, I translate, I write down, and I share the piece with them and their family. Often this is very good because then they can correct spelling mistakes of names. But then there are also moments where they say, oh, can you remove that? I didn't say that. And it's really often, not so much with older people, with younger people, where they may have said something, when we are speaking, we are very free. They may have said something about, again, the other. And then they see it written down and they say, no, I didn't say that. And I said, well, you did, because I have it recorded. But there is a perception of how someone wants to be seen as well. And you have to respect it as long as it doesn't deviate too far away from the story they have told. You cannot doctor a narrative. You can't manipulate it. But if someone doesn't want details in, then you have to respect that. Similarly, I've conducted full interviews, written stories. People have read it and they said, we don't want it in the book, after doing all the work, which is also fine.
Have you tried to protest against them, saying that I really love this and I really want it in the book? Has that ever happened?
I have, but then I think if someone is really against the manner in which that they have told you the story and you have rendered it in text, then they'd rather just write the story themselves. For me, when I do an interview, I don't go in with saying, मुझे ये मिलेगा, ये मिलेगा, ये मिलेगा. जो मिलेगा काफ़ी है. Because sometimes you go in and you don't get anything. Like I went in to speak to a gentleman once in Amritsar and all I got was, आपको पता है कि 30s में train को AC कैसे करते थे? He didn't say anything else. He didn't say anything that I could use in my book, but I learned that when a train is running, they put, blocks of ice between the track and the thing, और फिर वो ठंडी हवा ऊपर जाती थी first compartment और वो AC बन जाता था. So that's also, now here I am telling you guys. So you learn something or the other. And when you're a field researcher, ये सब चलता है. Like, you learn not to sweat these things. There are way more questions than I initially thought. Yeah, hi. For sure. Yes. It's a really great question, and I think the first thing I have to say is that you have to be transparent about your own bias. If it's there, it's there. If you're working towards it, mention it. I'll tell you, I'll give you a very concrete example. And I've written it exactly like this in my books. I was interviewing someone who is Hindu, whose family remained in Pakistan. My question was, why? Right? But they were quite young. Like right now, they are even younger than I am. So it's a part of my second book, Descendant Interviews. And I was basically asking them, why did they stay back? What was their circumstances? What are the conditions? How were they treated? Now, they come from a small village called Mithi in Sindh, closer to Rajasthan than Karachi, really, which is 95% Hindu. So they stayed in this pocket of Hindus even after partition. And all through the interview, they were calling themselves Pakistani Hindu. And all through the interview, I was saying Hindu Pakistani. you understand there's a difference between those two things? For them, their prime identity is their nationality, which is Pakistani, and religion comes later. For me, I don't know why I was doing this. I don't say Muslim Indian, I don't say Christian Indian, I don't say Hindu Indian, I don't say Jewish Indian, Parsi Indian. Why was I saying Hindu Pakistani? This is my bias. And I write it exactly like that in the book. I don't know what, I can't, there's no terminology for this bias, but I felt it, I said it, and then I rectified myself. So it's really important to show that the researcher isn't devoid of, I mean, this was not a dangerous bias. I wasn't saying anything that had grave ramifications, but I had to check myself. And I guess if you're somebody who works in this field, every day you will be working on this, every day, right? Because you have been raised in a certain country with a certain national allegiance. Naturally, it will impact how you feel and what you say. Yeah.
So firstly, thank you so much for really opening our eyes today. But my question is, so, for example, in Indian education, a lot of history is quite statistical and quite cold. And I feel like that comes out from the idea that a historian should be unbiased, and they're forced to be cold that way. You've managed to blend. I think oral history is something that you'd mentioned. I'd firstly like to know a lot about what that means. And my question really is that, you've refreshingly found a lot of different angles on the stories that you've picked. How do you know that you've, reached enough, that you've got every angle, every piece of context that can be published? Because, as you said, there's a responsibility. And so existentially, how do you deal with that responsibility to others when you write something?
Such a great question. I've never been asked that. In 10 years, that's saying a lot. I guess the easy answer is that you don't, and you're never going to be able to please everybody. You may think that you can, again, the limitation of oral history is that your writing or research is only based on the interviews you collect. You may not be able to find every community. You may not be the right person to interview every community. Can I speak for Sindhis who came from Sindh and settled in Gujarat? Probably not. To some extent, maybe, speaking largely to partition, but the specificity of community, language, ethnicity, cultural change, I don't think I would do justice, right? There are certain interviews in my books that refer to tribes of Kutch or look at Kutchi as the closest possible linguistic relationship to Sindhi, but I won't understand. I'm not the right person. So there will always be limitations in your research, and the minute you understand that you will not please everybody, you will be happier and more excited about your research. Because when the book comes out, there are first book, second book, third book, everybody said you haven't done this, you haven't done that, you haven't done these people that. Hoga, hamesha hoga. It is an existential question, right? But there will be scholars out there who are better suited to record those histories than you are, and maybe what you can do is say, hey, I can help you, or I don't know, collaborate in some way, but you will never be able to exhaust every possible angle, so to speak. The fact that 60-something years after partition I was able to see with fresh eyes is exceptional, which tells you that any historical event, when viewed through the prism of oral testimony and memory, will always offer infinite perspectives. There will always be future, like you are, I don't know if you're the generation after me, which is certainly younger than me, maybe you'll find a newer way to look at it, a different way to look at it, No one has done any work on the camps, putting it out there for anyone who wants to venture there. There's always going to be something to study, but it was a magnanimous event. It touched too many people in too many different ways. So, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, hi.
Hi.
First of all, you are a great storyteller, I must say that. And I'm surely going to read these books because learning through experiences or just listening to different perspectives of the same event is really eye-opening.
For me as well.
Yeah, so my question for you is that when interviewing such people, do you always just keep this criteria in your head that you only want to cover the emotional history? Or do you ever feel like when they are talking about it, the political history is also sort of altered? Because everyone must have had different experiences, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Because I have a story to tell. I'm sorry, but like my nanny used to live in Junagadh, if you know, and in that time, Junagadh
Vested
yeah.
state.
Yes. So it hadn't yet declared whether it wanted to be a part of India or Pakistan. So in the written history, it has been told that the Nawab, respectfully was left the city, the state, and it was like a very filtered way of describing what had actually happened. When I asked my nanny about the same thing, कि मेरी एसएस की textbook में ये लिखा है, जूनागढ़ का नाम आया है, what do you have to say about this? She was like, no, not at all. He ran away. He ran away overnight. He kept all his jewelry in some beggar's closet because there was a lot of black money maybe, and he just ran away. That piece of information books will never be able to cover. So is there any such story that you might know about, which you couldn't cover in the book maybe because
But
it
no,
was...
I think you must. Like I had, almost every person has a different political perspective as well. Like people who lived through partition. My grandmother, when I ask her, ये क्यों हो रहा है, ये partition क्यों हो रहा है, she says, oh, something happened in Bombay and all these political leaders were talking and then they decided, well, she's lived through partition, she's migrated. She cannot tell me the exact specificities of it, which tells you that everyone obviously also had a different political understanding and depth. What oral history allows you to do is disrupt state-censored histories, jingoistic histories, or diluted histories. Your grandmother's perception of Junagadh is valuable. It means something. And someone else from Junagadh will have a different perspective, which is also very important to cover. Sometimes what I do is I put 2 or 3 different perspectives from the same area right next to each other in the book. So you can see, like I remember in my second book, there were 2 interviews from Mirpur, one a Hindu, one a Muslim. They were right next to one another in the book. And I remember, because I have done so much work with Hindu and Sikh Mirpuris, when I was speaking to the Muslim Mirpuri, he told me something that was completely opposite. And I stopped myself from saying, no, that's not how it was, because his version is different, right? But this is what oral history allows you to do. It is, the strength of oral history is the diversity of its narrative. The methodology will come with a lot of issues. People will say, well, how can you prove memory, and what is the veracity of your testimony? And this is a question I used to be very concerned with answering early on, but now I don't care about it. The written archive is one archive. It is not the only archive. The written archive is also a perspective of somebody. Usually, in our case, the British or some former victor. So why is your grandmother's perception, her perspective, her memory, not another equally valuable archive? Right? They have to work with each other. So everyone I speak to talks of the politics of partition, and it is always different than what the archive says.
Totally. Thank you so much.
Oh, right here, yeah.
Okay, first of all, great presentation.
Thank you.
I learned a lot. So my question is, my first question is, why do you feel like it's important to cover like the political perspectives of every single individual?
Why is it important to record political perspectives of
Like,
individuals?
Do you feel that like history should be more than facts and figures, and like
Yeah.
fully
I mean,
individual?
I personally, yes. History is already more than. History is people. People are not numbers. Like one day you will become history, right? So you are a person. You have individuality. You mean something. So I feel like we need to remember a person for a person. They can't become a statistic,
Yes, and
right?
MS.
My second question is like, how will you convince, like, can you just describe the process of like the conversations going from the objects to the stories of the partition? Because I'm really interested in how to have conversations.
They were different. Like you can't start with partition. So I mean, keep in mind that all of these people were elderly. They were. My oldest friend turned 100 earlier this month, if that puts things in context. So you can't go in and say, oh, hey, tell me about partition. You have to talk to them about their day, about their children, चाय क्या खाओगे बेटा मेरी तंबोला ऐसी थी और मेरी किटी पार्टी ऐसी थी ये वाली बातें भी चलती हैं ये बहुत चलती हैं अच्छा आपकी शादी क्यों नहीं अच्छा मेरा ग्रैंडसन है ये सब चलता है ये बहुत होता है because they're old people ये होता है but I mean this is all like small talk but it's so essential to get someone to trust you because again this is the first question that was asked like how do you ask people questions right because what they will give you is something that's so emotionally deep for them so you have to establish some form of trust और कभी कभी वो होता है कभी नहीं होता but they have to know that you are there to listen to them sometimes in my case this meant sitting 4 or 5 or 6 hours train मेरी छूट गई एक बार plane मेरा miss हो गया because I was listening to a conversation people one of the ladies I was speaking to was saying aren't you tired listening to this and I said you've never said this to anybody else before so I'm not tired I want to listen I think this is just my perspective but because everyone around these people had gone through the same thing like my grandmother my grandfather her sister her mother the neighbor everyone had gone through the same thing they didn't think what they had lived through was something exceptional and they normalized it there was a normalization of the circumstances of being partitioned which is not a normal circumstance to begin with you don't just get up one day leave your home go to a foreign place learn a new language learn a new skill get a new job and never see your home again that's not normal and yet it happens till this very day so the process of fleeing from your home is something that's extraordinarily difficult and exceptional and needs to be recorded so it often took people time to realize what they were saying was important and valuable for the recording of history and just like when the books were published they couldn't believe that their story was in a book or I mean not just my book any book for that matter any oral historian that does that when the participant, the interviewee, the person that you have spoken to reads it and sees that their story matters and it's going to matter to future generations, it's a really big deal. It contributes to knowledge.
So it's like basically you just had small talk and then at one point you just
Basically.
what
Basically.
partition weren't they shocked?
No, it's more complex than that. They knew what I was there for. The small talk is just to make them comfortable, right? You just think about speaking to a trauma victim, any form of trauma. You need to make them trust you. They know what they're there for, you know what they're there for, but you don't just dive into the deep end of a swimming pool and expect to come out alive or well or unharmed. You have to work your way there, and sometimes this means seeing people multiple times. But small talk helps. We must not omit small talk.
Has it ever been the case that they, like, despite all that, they
All the time. All the time. It's perfectly all right if that happens as well. All the time. I can go to someone's house, I can travel for 2 hours and they can say, मन नहीं है आज बात करने का. ठीक है. मैं कल आऊँगी.
Good evening. Two things.
No, she's too old now.
And did you ever come across people who went back to their original houses, places? What was their experience like?
It's varied. I don't think I can say everyone had a uniform experience. Some people found their houses broken down. Certainly not as beautiful as this. Other people found residents living in the house. There's a very funny story in one of my books where, people, like, they didn't trust banks at the time before partition. So they would bury things in the floors and the walls. बड़े लोग अपनी चीज़ें gold वगैरह गाड़ के आए थे. And this family, this man had buried gold in the courtyard. And many, many years after partition, he went back. And he went to the house and he said, मैं यहाँ घर में रहता था, ये मेरा घर था, and this he goes to Lahore. And the Lahori residents say, आप अंदर आइए, and they're very nice, and he sees कि वो सारी चीज़ें उनकी इस्तेमाल हो रही हैं अभी भी. And just as like a passing thing, he says कि मैं और मेरे भाई ने ना यहाँ सोना गाड़ा था. ठीक है, fine. हो गया ख़त्म, चाय वाय पी ली, वो चले गए. हफ्ते बाद वो इंडिया वापस आ रहे थे, तो they went to say goodbye कि हम जा रहे हैं, let's keep in touch. पूरा घर, it was all dug up. It was all dug up. There are also instances where social media plays a huge role in these things, you know. There was a small, now the thing is, sometimes I play a role in these, but I just play a tiny role, then things happen, just like with Sitara Fiaz Ali. I wrote a little story about a house that someone had left in Pakistan. And someone wrote, it was on Instagram, someone wrote saying, I'm from this place, I would love to show them the house. The person whose house it used to be, her son, wrote, can we talk? They began talking. So this lady in Pakistan says, I can show you the house, and he says, okay. And then the parents talk, the woman who left the house behind, she speaks, and then they invite me to be a part of this big conversation just like a day or two before Independence Day or something, a couple of years ago. And this phone is being taken around this mohalla in Pakistan showing ये आपका घर है, ये खड़ा हुआ है, ये दूसरा वाला आपके अंकल का घर है, यहाँ ये जो पेड़ आपने मुझे बताया था ये पेड़ है. And the lady who left the house, her son, when I speak to him, he says to me, I feel like I have seen the place. All my life, I thought to myself, is this house waiting for my mother? Does the house know that she will return? Can I touch the house in my dreams? And now, even this weird online way of looking at it, it means something, you know? So, all kinds of stories.
Another very, I don't know if it's an appropriately worded question, but suppose somebody went back to their house and let's take an example, they're from Pakistan, they came to India, saw their house, and now they have to return back to Pakistan. So there is a sense of some sort of attachment to this house and that house as well. How do they deal with that? Where to stay now? Because again, not very.
Like stay in memory, or I mean, they can't stay physically.
I saw my old house.
Yeah.
I'm so attached to it. I used to live there for so long. Now I need to go back to the new house that I made. How do I deal with this sense? How do they?
That is the burden of history. It is possible to, that's why I started the way I started. He was made to flee. Everyone in his family died. And still he says, when I die, you put my ashes in the Aknoor river, the Chenab river in Aknoor, so that it flows westward to Pakistan. There has to be something really kind of, I don't think it has words like this feeling of homeland. It's so strong. But I mean, you have to reason with the fact that you can only live in that in memory. You can't physically live in it, you know? Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Okay, we have time for just one last question because there's another event happening here and we need to clear out the place for those guys. So just one last question.
Good evening, ma'am. your presentation was very nice. It was kind of emotional. And the question I want to ask is that when you interviewed people, did they have any anger or like resentment towards like political leaders? Did they share views on that time of political leaders?
All the time. मतलब इतना लोग सब against everybody, against Nehru, against Patel, against Gandhi, against Jinnah, everyone. Against less against the British actually, if you think about it. Right? It's funny, right? 200 years of slavery and everyone wants to go to Covent Garden still. Less against the British, and I found this very interesting that there is so much bitterness between India and Pakistan, and of course bitterness for politicians of that time, but there's really not enough bitterness against the colonizer. But yes, people spoke very freely about politicians, good and bad. Absolutely. If they had ever come in contact with them, or if they saw them, or if they heard news or anything. Yeah, go ahead.
And I want to add something. I live in Morbi. So, like 7 years ago, my parents bought a house there. And coincidentally, the owner of the house is Soda ji. His surname is Soda. So, he's from Pakistan.
He was from there.
He was from Pakistan.
Yeah.
Yes.
Nice.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, maybe like last. जी. Okay, नहीं उसके बाद कुछ नहीं. आ रहा है माइक आपके पास.
Of all the stories, each story is unique.
Yeah.
But there's some common ground. So I'm assuming you've interviewed people who were young during the time of partition, some who were teenage, some who might have even been adult. Was there any difference in the pain that they had inflicted and their narrative, depending on the age that they were during partition?
Great question. You mean the pain that they experienced, right? Yeah, so like I said, the very, very young people, for them it's almost second-hand memory. They would have been like, I have now interviewed people who were born on the way. I have interviewed people who were 2 or 3 years old that didn't understand what was happening. I interviewed someone who was born on the day. Right, a midnight's child. But it's very sad. The day he was born, 2 of his sisters died by the hands of their father's sword because he was worried for women's safety. So he was born and they died on the same day. So he carries a guilt that has really nothing to do with him. People that were older, of course, had more, I think they carried a kind of very physical pain, especially if they were never allowed to go back to see their home. Like my grandfather was 19. He was a young man. He was just angry that he was being made to flee from his home. He was angrier because he was never able to see it again. But actually, I think he was just sad. That sadness just culminated as anger. He loved where he came from. He loved the people, Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian. It was just sad. So, yeah, I think one of the other things that people who were very, very young at the time remember or always mention is that everything was very big. So, a lady always said, "Itna bada gurdwara tha, itna bada masjid tha." And then when she went back, she said, actually, it wasn't so big. I was just very small. Yeah, so there's a difference. There's always a difference. And it's very interesting to see that. It's a great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe we can speak later, outside. Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.
This was really very intriguing. Thank you so much, Aanchal, for sharing all of this with us. Thank you for being a lovely audience. Can we please empty the hall in next 5 minutes? Thank you.